Number 2. Grotius argues that, in the state of nature, individuals enjoyed a legitimate right to avail themselves of whatever was necessary to fulfill their needs. This right, however, should not be confused with a property right. Grotius points out that in the same word, dominium is used to refer to different concepts, namely the right to use an object and the right to own it. The first kind of right is not, according to Grotius, a human creation, but the expression of a natural law, the second law of nature. But a property right, on the other hand, is a human institution. It came into existence through a gradual process of individuals' interactions with each other. Grotius's thesis is that, in the state of nature, one has a legitimate right, jus, to use an object that is common, communis, to everyone. The word communis, like the word dominium, is ambiguous, for it can mean either something that has no owner at all, or something that belongs to everyone. In the state of nature, to say that an object is common does not mean to say that everyone possesses it, but rather that it does not belong to anyone. If an object belongs to everyone, then it is called public. The right that one enjoys in the state of nature is defined by Grotius in terms of a power, facultas, to make a non-just, non-injustias, use of what is common to everyone, that is, what has no owner. A distinguishing feature of the non-unjust use of an object is that has no owner is that anyone is entitled to use it, with the proviso that it is not being used by another person. This proviso is established by the fourth law of nature. I may, for instance, sail from one point to another throughout the seas. No one could legitimately stop my ship and require me to turn away. True, a more powerful captain could compel me by means of violence to take another route, but his actions would represent, according to Grotius, a transgression of the second law of nature. For this reason, I would be morally entitled, though perhaps not physically capable, to resist and insist on my right to use the sea. Nevertheless, neither I nor anybody else can legitimately claim a property right over the sea. The basic idea here is that if an object is common, in either sense of the word, I may use it as long as it is not being used by another party, and as long as I use it, no one is entitled to take this object from me, even if no one formally possesses it. This is indeed a very basic principle, for it pervades almost every ambit of our social life. Consider, for instance, the occupation of a bench in a public park. I may sit on the bench if it is empty, and as long as I sit on it, no one can simply require me to stand up in order to occupy the same bench. Nevertheless, I do not possess the bench. In like manner, I may, for instance, pick up a product from the shelf of a supermarket, and as long as I hold the product in my hand or place it in the shopping cart, no one can simply take it from me, even if I do not yet formally possess it. Who gets hold of a common object prior to another party has, for this very reason, priority in using it. This basic idea is so fundamental for the functioning of our social life that one might feel tempted to assume, as Grotius did, that it is not a simple human convention, but the expression of a natural law, the validity of which not even the skeptic could reasonably put into question. The next step in Grotius's argument consists, then, in elucidating how the concept of property right may be derived from a more basic concept of use right. Grotius realized that, in some circumstances, one cannot make use of an object without definitely depriving other persons of using it later. When I pick up, for instance, an apple from a tree and eat it, I prevent other persons from eating the same apple in the future. By using it, the apple, in a certain sense, becomes part of me. Grotius affirms that, in this case, the object is converted into the substance of the user. Accordingly, I become the proprietor of the apple, for now it cannot belong to anybody else. For this reason, Grotius points out that a clear-cut conceptual distinction between use right and property right could not be drawn in these cases. As he puts it in De jure praede, with respect to such items as food and drink, a certain form of property ownership was inseparable from use, and in De jure belli ac pagis, he affirms that the right to use an object by consuming it was, in the state of nature, a substitute for the property right. Grotius refers to objects such as food and drink as items of the first kind, prioris generis. These objects are necessary for life for this reason. The second law of nature determines that we may seize and keep them. But there are also a variety of objects that are necessary for life, only in a very indirect way. They do not really provide us with more safety, incolumitatis, albeit they grant us some degree of comfort, commoditatis. According to Grotius, objects such as clothes, chattels, land, etc., which are necessary for life in an indirect way, are items of a posterior kind, posterioris generis. These objects may be either movable, mobiles, like cloths, chattels, or unmovable, immobiles, such as fields. Objects of the posterior kind do not become one's property in the same way that objects of the first kind do, for they can be used without being used up. That is, one could in principle make use of them without necessarily preventing other persons from using them later. Which conditions, then, must be fulfilled for a person to be in a position to claim not simply a use right, but a property right over an object of the posterior kind? Grotius argues that the existence of an object as one's private property is in a certain sense produced by reason. Ratione quadrum productum est. In other words, private property is not a natural state of affairs, but something produced by human reason. For nature, by itself, does not bestow property rights upon any person. Grotius' thesis is that in the state of nature, individuals gradually came to behave towards objects of the posterior kind as though they had the same features of an object of the first kind, that is, as something incorporated into the very substance of their users. The objects themselves did not undergo any change, but the way people envisaged them did. Grotius refers to this kind of change in terms of a mental act. His argument in this regard is that initially, when we get hold of an object in order to use it, we have to recur to some sort of physical effort, applicationem corporalem, which he calls occupation, occupatio. As long as a person legitimately occupies an object in such a way that the occupation does not result from the usurpation of the right that another party had to occupy it in the first instance, this person may resist, even by means of violence, any encroachments upon the object that he or she occupies. At first, the resistance against the inroads of belligerent party happens in the same way that occupation itself began, namely, through some kind of physical effort. But among rational beings, an occupation that began with a physical effort may, after some time, endure mentally, that is, the occupation may simply be retained in the mind, animo retinere. Grotius is not explicit at this point, but it is fairly reasonable to assume that an occupation cannot be kept in the mind of a unilateral basis, that is, only in the mind of the occupying party. It is also necessary that the other parties recognize that the object as something to which the person in question has a legitimate claim. Private property, thus, arises out of collective recognition that a person is entitled to retain or keep for oneself an object he or she has occupied in the first instance. But it might be questioned now, to which extent does a property right differ from a simple use right? How exactly does a mental act comprehended in terms of collective recognition give rise to a property right? The transition from the natural right to use something useful for life to the institutional right to possess a thing that makes life more comfortable constitutes a crucial step in Grotius' theory of private property. Grotius draws a terminological distinction between the occupation of a movable object and the occupation of an unmovable object. Occupation of movable objects is apprehension, and of unmovable objects is fortress or boundary. Occupatio. The second kind of occupation should enable us to distinguish more clearly property right from use right. Let me resume the example of use right that I have mentioned before. In the state of nature, I have a right to use the seas, but I do not possess the seas. But let us suppose now that I, in collective works with other persons, continually use for fishing and transport a small fraction of the sea, say, that fraction of the sea adjacent to the shores of the region in which I and other persons have settled for some time. There were no settlers before we came. As long as we, the first settlers, occupy this otherwise small fraction of the ocean, we have a legitimate use right over it. For this reason, we may resist by means of violence other parties' attempts to take it from us. Let us suppose that we succeed in building some machines, such as catapults or cannons, that enable us to keep prospective invaders at a safe distance of, say, 3 miles off. Grotius's point is that in the long run, through continual occupation and defense of this small fraction of the sea, there may appear the collective recognition, both on the side of the settlers and the side of prospective invaders, that the first settlers have not only a use right over that small fraction of sea, but a property right over it. This is an important point, for it means that we have now a legitimate claim over this portion of the seas, even during the time we are not really using it for fishing or transport. This is indeed the way maritime boundaries came to be established in the 17th century. As John Ruggie puts it, the principle which was first enunciated by Hugo Grotius at the beginning of the 17th century, and which states slowly came to adopt, was one that defined an international maritime order in 2 parts. Territorial sea under exclusive state control, which custom eventually set at 3 miles because that was the range of land-based cannons at the time, and the high seas beyond, available for common use, but owned by none. What holds for unmovable objects such as territorial seas also holds for unmovable objects such as fields and land. Let us suppose further that the first settlers may have used the soil for agriculture, and in order to protect the fruits of their cooperative work against pillage and plunder, they may also have erected walls around the fields they cultivated. The wall acted then as a physical barrier against the onslaught of possible invaders. In the long run, the occupation that began with a physical effort and was at first maintained by dint of a physical barrier may have been simply retained in the mind of all the parties involved. The wall may have decayed, and in its place there remained just a line reminiscent of the limits of the original occupation. Because the occupation was retained in the mind of all the parties involved, this line functions now as wall, even though it does not really have the physical properties of a wall. This line is actually a boundary, limitatio. It is something that exists not only in virtue of its physical properties, but as a result of the collective recognition that the first settlers have a legitimate property right over the region they have successfully occupied, cultivated, and defended. According to Grotius, the existence of a property right presupposes the existence of the previous natural right to use something that has no owner. But it is important to stress that a property right is, nevertheless, a human institution and not a natural state of affairs. In this regard, the thrust of Grotius' account of the emergence of private property as something in a certain sense produced by reason, and retained in the mind of all parties involved, does not differ much from the account of private property that John Searle proposes in the context of his theory of institutional facts. A close examination of Searle's theory would be beyond the scope of this present paper. My intention is simply to point out that Grotius explains the origins of private property in a way that is similar to Searle's account of the ontology of such things as territorial boundaries, property rights, money, etc. Searle argues that, through collective recognition, human beings are able to ascribe to objects certain functions that could not be performed solely in virtue of their physical properties. His account of the establishment of a boundary is particularly opposite for our discussion here. Searle affirms that the line of stones of a long decayed wall acquires the status of a territorial boundary from the moment individuals start to behave towards the line as though it were a wall. As he puts it, that is, we imagine that the wall continues to serve its function, but no longer in virtue of its physical structure. It serves its function in virtue of the fact that it has a certain recognized status. When Grotius affirms in the passage from De Jure Praede that I have examined above, that private property is, in a certain sense, produced by reason, and that an occupation can be retained in the mind, he has in mind the same basic idea. We recognize an object of the posterior kind as though it had the same status of an object of the first kind. We recognize the boundary, limitatio, of a region as having the same status of a fortress, instructio. In a previous text in which Searle discusses the same example, the establishment of territorial boundaries, he also affirms that the function can be performed only in virtue of a collective agreement or acceptance. In De Jure Belli Actu Pagis, Grotius, in like manner, sustains that there is a sort of agreement or acceptance underlying the institution of private property. In this text, Grotius resumes the account of private property that he had advanced in De Jure Praede. But he argues now that the private property emerges not through a mental act alone, non animi actu solo, but through a pact, pacto, that may be either explicit, expresso, or tacit, tacito. That is, through some sort of agreement or acceptance. Let me quote the relevant passage in full. Thus we see what was the original of property, which was derived not from a mere internal act of the mind, non animi actu solo, since one could not possibly guess what others designed to appropriate to themselves, that he might abstain from it. And besides, several might have a mind to the same thing at the same time, but it resulted from a certain compact and agreement, either expressly, as by division, or else tacitly, as by seizure. For as soon as living in common was no longer approved of, all men were supposed, and ought to be supposed to have consented, that each should be appropriate to himself, by right of first possession, which could not have been divided. Grotius' theory of property right involves, as we can see, three basic steps. First, an object is apprehended or occupied by means of some physical effort. Second, the object at issue is used. One is entitled to go through the first and second steps inasmuch as one proceeds in consonance with the second and fourth laws of nature, namely, one may apprehend or occupy an object with the proviso that it is not already being used by another party. The third step is taken through the collective recognition or acceptance that one is entitled to keep an object even when it is not being used. In De Jure Praede, Grotius refers to this act of recognition or acceptance as something, in a certain sense, produced by reason and retained in the mind. These are mental acts. Yet Grotius does not expressly state in De Jure Praede that these acts are performed at a collective basis, that is, by all parties involved in the recognition that an object, such as for instance a piece of cloth or a fraction of the ocean, counts as someone's private property. But in the passage from De Jure Belli Actu Pagis quoted above, Grotius is more precise as far as this point is concerned, for he adduces now that private property arises not from a mere mental act, non animi actu solo, but through a pact that may either be express or simply tacit.